This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
In the untouched regions of the forest, the kōkako runs through the treetops feeding on leaves, flowers and fruit. The South Island kōkako, with its distinctive orange wattles at the base of the bill, hasn't been sighted in many years and may be extinct. A situation the blue-wattled bird of the North Island may find itself in unless its habitat is preserved. Its delightful call includes a variety of rich organ and bell-like notes.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.nz.
Good morning, friends. Today we have Jonathan Boston, who's the Emeritus Professor of Policy Studies at Victoria University in Wellington and the School of Government. And he's also a member of the expert working group on managed retreat. You can podcast this by going to oar.org.nz and then going to podcast and then going to community or chaos. And you'll find most of the interviews I've done this year will be available to you. Jonathan, it's good to have you back.
Good to see you, Marvin, and good to be with you over this coming hour or so.
Can you talk about property insurance and resilience in connection with climate change?
Yes, so Marvin, as you mentioned, several years ago, I was a member of the expert working group on managed retreat, and that was a group established by the Ministry for the Environment to explore the challenge that in particular, sea level rise over the coming century and beyond will pose for many coastal communities. And in the process of helping with that working group, it became clear to me that property insurance, and particularly residential property insurance, was going to be an issue of increasing significance over the coming decades. Our terms of reference were such that looking at the future of residential property insurance was not one of the many issues that we were asked to reflect on, but it was pretty clear that there were significant interactions between the impact of climate change on property risk, the expectation of significant sea level rise and the damage that that will do to coastal communities, and then the impact that that would have on insurance matters, and so forth. So cutting to the chase, I, subsequent to us completing that report several years ago, I decided to take a bit more interest in the future of residential property insurance, with particular reference to the situation here in New Zealand. So cutting to the chase, I wrote an article several years ago on the topic, which was a sort of a tester. And while I was on study leave in 2024 in London, I talked to lots of insurers and other people connected to some of the issues around the impact of climate change on property, particularly residential property. And then over the last year, I have written a book on the future of residential property insurance with particular reference to New Zealand. And that book will be published in a couple of months by Te Herangawaka University Press, formerly known as Victoria University Press. So that in a nutshell, just by way of background. And I suppose the key issues, Marvin, that climate change raises are the following. The first is that climate change will increase the amount and range of natural hazard risks that countries like New Zealand face. We already have significant natural hazard risks of other kinds, particularly geophysical risks like earthquakes, but climate change is going to add to that. We're going to have, as we've witnessed in recent years, more powerful storms, more intense rainfall, more stronger winds, and as a result of all that, more flooding, more damage to property, and over the coming decades and beyond, increasing sea level rise. That is going to make insurance more unaffordable for many people unless we take measures to address that. And it's also going to result in insurers refusing to insure certain properties, what is called insurance retreat. And so the book that I've written focuses on the question, really, how do we minimize insurance unaffordability and insurance unavailability in the context of a climate impacted world? And I've laid out the nature of the issues and some of the policy responses that we could make.
Insurance is really kind of a gamble in a way, isn't it, for the insurance company, because they have to gamble that most of their insurees won't have to call on them, and also that when the ones that do call on them will be assured enough to cover.
That's right.
These things are, it's harder to look ahead and predict than it was 20 years ago before climate change.
Yes. So as climate change increases the sort of the amount of risk in the environment, so too that poses challenges for insurers. So insurers then have to increase their investment in assessing risk and in pricing that risk and in making decisions as to whether or not it's worth their while insuring certain properties, be they residential or non-residential properties. And what has been happening around the world over the last few decades, Marvin, is that insurers have been increasing the cost of insurance as they've recognized that the amount of damage that's occurring to property is going up. And in some areas around the world, they have been ceasing to provide insurance cover because it's simply not profitable for them to do so. Bear in mind that most insurers are for-profit organizations, and they have a responsibility to their shareholders to protect the interests of those shareholders. They have a fiduciary duty, and they're not there, to subsidize people who happen to be living in areas of increasing risk. But if we have increasing insurance unaffordability and unavailability, that will reduce resilience as a society and as an economy. So that will be damaging to everyone. So part of my concern is to ensure that we can retain in New Zealand a high level of insurance availability and affordability in a context where insurers will be obviously wanting to increase their risk premiums and or insurance premiums to take into account increasing risk, and also wanting to cease to insure certain properties because they simply think the risks are too great. And so part of the problem is, what do we do about that? And I suppose one other thing that's really important for people to understand is that for some 80 years or so, New Zealand has had what used to be called the Earthquake and War Damage Commission. Then it became the Earthquake Commission, or EQC. And in recent years, it's been called the Natural Hazards Commission. And that entity was established as a public Crown entity to ensure that major geophysical risks, particularly earthquakes, were properly insured in this country in a context where, in the 1930s and 40s, insurers were increasingly unwilling to take on earthquake risk because of the magnitude of that risk. And here in Wellington, where I live in particular, insurers were very reluctant to provide earthquake cover in their insurance policies. So the government at the time stepped in and established this Earthquake and War Damage Commission. Bear in mind, there was also the Second World War around that time, and there was the potential for significant damage particularly from the Japanese, which thankfully didn't materialize. And so for 80 years, we've had this entity, EQC, now Natural Hazards Commission, which has provided, in effect, comprehensive insurance cover for geophysical risks. But, and this is the crucial point, it doesn't cover climate-related risks like increased flooding risk, increased risk of hail storms, increased risk of very severe windstorms or wildfires, nor does it cover properties that are going to be at risk from sea level rise. And so a core part of my book is really about how do we think about reshaping our current policy framework and institutions to take account of this significant increase in the risk environment, particularly driven by climate change.
How does the government feel about this, and how does ACT as part of the government now? Do they believe in the public should support insurance for the public?
Yes. So in terms of the Natural Hazards Commission, there has been no move by the government to do away with that commission. So that suggests that notwithstanding a view by some in the policy community, the government shouldn't be involved in kind of helping to provide insurance cover. Notwithstanding that, the government has remained committed to having the kind of framework that has now been in place for, more than 3 generations across multiple governments. On the other hand, the government seems to be wanting to distinguish between geophysical risks and flood risk. And so while it's happy to have a Natural Hazards Commission that has responsibility, at least to some extent, for for geophysical risks, it doesn't want to extend the mandate of the Natural Hazards Commission to cover climate-related risks such as flooding and more severe winds. And this is arguably something of a paradox or a contradiction. So one of the things my book looks at is the kind of philosophical issues at stake in the debate about whether or not the Natural Hazards Commission should have its mandate extended by Parliament to embrace a wider range of perils. And it's important, Marvin, that listeners understand that around the world, many developed countries like New Zealand have the equivalent of a Natural Hazards Commission. They take different forms, but in many cases, they cover flood risk and other weather-related risks, as well as geophysical risks. So while we are not unique in only covering geophysical risks, we're somewhat unusual. So, if the argument is made, well, elsewhere in the world, governments don't cover flood risk, that's simply untrue. Governments all over the world, including the United States, United Kingdom, and across Europe, cover flood risk, at least to some extent, through an entity of a similar kind to our Natural Hazards Commission, although these entities do differ significantly in their governance arrangements, their funding arrangements, whether they seek reinsurance cover, and so on and so on.
Our strategic choices and political decisions, are they also ultimately moral and ethical choices?
Absolutely. No, absolutely, Marvin. So looking at this problem, you can sort of identify 2 broad kind of approaches philosophically. On the one hand, there is the view that insurance is essentially a private good, and that if people want to buy insurance to cover the risks to their property, whether it's residential or non-residential, that is their business, that is their choice. That this is not something that government should have an interest in or be involved in. And that approach leads to a view that insurers should be allowed to just get on with the business of providing insurance cover, setting their premiums in accordance with the level of risk that the properties in question face. So you have a sort of actuarially based risk approach and the pricing of risk in accordance with the assessed risks to the property. And you have in that model also a view that if insurers aren't willing to provide cover, well, sort of too bad for the property owners. they'll simply have to cope as best they can in the absence of insurance. And the argument here is partly that if you have this kind of framework in which risk is priced reasonably accurately, and insurers can withdraw from insuring high-risk properties, that this will then influence property prices in ways that are deemed to be kind of efficient, and also that it will discourage people from building in areas that are significant risk of natural hazard events. So that's sort of model one. Model two is quite different philosophically. It accepts the proposition that insurance, whether it's residential or non-residential insurance, is a private good from which people can be excluded. But it says, no, it's not just a private good, it's also what could be called a social good or a merit good. In other words, it's the kind of good that actually people ought to be encouraged to take on or consume because it's in the wider interests of the economy and society to have high levels of insurance cover in the interest of resilience, in the interest of quicker recovery when natural disasters strike, as they do, and in the interests of reducing sort of stress and anxiety and inequality and suffering when you have major natural hazard events like earthquakes or big floods. And in that model, if insurance is deemed to be a merit good or a social good, then there is a case for not relying exclusively on risk-based pricing, but in fact to try and share the insurance burden in a more collective or solidaristic way. So instead of focusing on simply pricing risk and seeing what that sort of produces, you say, no, we need to moderate the effects of the market so that we can ensure that people can afford insurance and that insurance is actually going to be available to them. Now, just a couple of other points to make here, Marvin. One of the things that New Zealand has at the moment is a form of subsidized home insurance through the Ministry of Social Development, or WINS. And to be honest, I didn't know about this when I started writing my book, and hardly anybody that I talked to knew about it. So since the mid-1990s, people on lower incomes who own their own property can claim under what's called the accommodation supplement for government subsidies to help them pay their mortgage and to help them pay their rates and their insurance. And you might ask, well, why is insurance included? Well, it's a slightly long story, but I'll try and make it as short as possible. During the big neoliberal reforms of the 1990s, the government decided to kind of move away from building lots of social housing and to put more emphasis on providing financial assistance to people who otherwise couldn't afford their rents or their mortgage. And so it introduced what was called the accommodation supplement. And when that new instrument was being designed by policymakers, there was a question as to, well, what costs related to owning or running a home should be eligible for people to claim against. And it was agreed that obviously rents should be. And then the question was, well, should mortgages be? And the view was taken, yes, they should, because the government decided that it should be neutral with respect to whether people rented or owned their own home. In other words, the government shouldn't take a view as to whether it was better to rent or better to own. And in that situation, it was decided that this new policy instrument, the accommodation supplement, should provide subsidies for low-income renters and low-income homeowners. But then the question became, well, if you're going to subsidize mortgages, you can't have a mortgage unless you have insurance in New Zealand. It's a fundamental limit. Banks and other lenders, understandably, take the view that if you want a mortgage, you've got to insure your property, because otherwise, if it burns down or something, you run the risk of the lender losing some of their money. So the people who were designing the accommodation supplement said, okay, well, we're going to have to include insurance costs as one of the costs you can claim if you own a home. So for 30 plus years, we've had this policy in place in which we provide insurance subsidies for people who own properties if you meet the relevant criteria. And Marvin, the remarkable thing about this is that it was introduced by a centre-right government, in fact, a very right-wing government, you might say. And it's entirely consistent with the second model that I was outlining, i.e. the more solidaristic model. It's essentially saying we should actually help enable people to pay for their insurance. Now, that's completely contrary to a market liberal model in which you sort of treat insurance just as you might treat, I don't know, a holiday in Bali or something. If people want to spend money on this, they can. And if they don't, well, and if they can't afford it, too bad. But, well, for 30 plus years, we've had in New Zealand a policy of subsidizing home insurance. And the very fact that we have that, and it's been uncontroversial now for more than 30 years, is an interesting phenomenon in itself. Anyway, that's a bit of a long story here, Marvin, but it highlights, these two philosophical views and the sort of inconsistencies and contradictions that we find when we explore actually what happens in practice, that the people who say they are on the market liberal end or the more market end of the spectrum actually have committed themselves to policies that are much more consistent with the other model. And that's where we are at the moment. We have a government that supports home insurance subsidies. We have a government that supports the Natural Hazards Commission taking responsibility to some extent for geophysical risks like earthquakes. But then somehow, in my view, rather contradictorily, says, oh, we're not going to help people who are suffering more severe flood risk.
Oh, I find that quite interesting because I didn't realize, I knew they had rate subsidies, but I didn't know they had insurance subsidies for homeowners. And I suspect that many, many homeowners who could use the help don't know that it's there. Indeed.
Absolutely, Marvin. In fact, the evidence is that only a very small number of people access that assistance. And
well, you can't access something you don't know about.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the most remarkable things in preparing and writing this book was that none of the people in the insurance industry I spoke to knew about it. None of the people in the Natural Hazards Commission that I spoke to knew about it. Very, very few officials knew about it. But mercifully, I sent my draft, the original draft, last year to someone who knows as much about the welfare state in New Zealand as almost anyone, an official who works for the government. And he got in touch almost immediately and said, you realize, Jonathan, you've written a chapter basically saying why we should probably introduce means-tested insurance subsidies for home insurance. But actually, Jonathan, we have it already. And I was stunned. I was absolutely stunned, as have many other people that I've spoken to. In fact, remarkably, people who read the original chapter that I wrote saying why we should have means-tested subsidies wrote back and said, well, Jonathan, I can understand why you might think that and say that, but no government would ever introduce such a policy. I had to write back to them and say, well, I've discovered we've had this policy in place for over 30 years, and it was introduced by a centre-right government, not by a centre-left government. So there's some, wonderful paradoxes in life sometimes, Marvin.
One of the interesting things, and I hope people are listening to this, is that often beneficiaries have complained because they haven't been given necessary information about what's available, including very basic things like food subsidies and so on.
Sure.
So that's something that should really be looked at. The other thing that...
Yes. I mean, Marvin, just to say, welfare policies typically are really complicated. And it's not surprising that we find that many people do not get the assistance to which they're entitled, because A, they often don't know that they're entitled to assistance, and B, the officials who are there to try and help them don't always know everything either. And there's huge complexities in the systems that anyway. Well, that's another topic.
Sure. Before we get off of housing, do you think they may have made a mistake in cutting back on state housing if you look at the results? When you subsidize rent, you're actually subsidizing the landlord more than the person getting the money in many cases.
In many cases, yes. So you're subsidizing both. But yes, I mean, I'm a firm believer in governments at all levels, central government and local governments and so on, providing significant social housing for people who otherwise can't afford it. If you go back, 90 years in New Zealand, the first Labour government began a program of substantial construction of social housing, a program that was agreed to ultimately by the national government that was elected in the late 1940s. And so over a period of time, about 40, 50 years or so now, and we moved from having only a small amount of social housing to having social housing constituting around 7% of the total housing stock, if you go back to about the 1980s. And then for largely ideological reasons, the building of new social housing and investing in existing social housing, that was cut back. And we now have, relatively speaking, only a few more social houses than we had 40 plus years ago. And whereas it used to be about 7% of the total housing stock, it's now around 4% of the total housing stock, one of the lowest in the developed world, incidentally, far lower than in many European countries. And as a result, as we know, many poor people, those with particular needs, disability issues, mental health issues, and so on, struggle to secure any kind of stable, long-term social housing because there simply isn't enough. So I'm a very firm believer in having an adequate supply of social housing. And in my view, we should be seeking to double the current social housing stock from around 75, 80,000 to 150, 160,000 over the next 10 years or so. But hardly anyone else, Marvin, supports my view on that, unfortunately.
Well, I think a lot of people, if they knew about it, a lot of ordinary people, and there's a whole generation of young people that aren't going to be able to buy out, and they won't necessarily be because they have disabilities or are socially inept. It's just the economy of buying a first house is much different than it was. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the 70s and 80s. And I bought my first house in the late 70s. And you got lots of, I was working for the post office, but you got lots of help either getting into a state house or buying a house.
Yes, indeed.
So no longer available.
That's right. So in addition to building lots of social housing between the mid-1930s and the sort of late 1970s, early 1980s, we also, as you say, Marvin, had policies in place that significantly encouraged people to buy their own home. And so we moved from having a situation where only around 50% of people owned their own home in the 1930s to a situation in the 1980s where around 73% of people owned their own home. Well, that number has now fallen back to the early 1960s. Not 1960s, until about sort of 62, 63, 64%. And as a result, vastly more people are now needing to rent. And as you say, that creates all manner of challenges, all the more so since most of that renting is in the private sector, not the public sector, because we have such a small quantum of social housing. And people renting in the private sector typically have limited tenure rights. They can easily be thrown out of the home that they're renting. And that creates all manner of social issues and educational challenges too, because you find children, now roughly 50% of children are in rental accommodation. And one of the things that results in is children having to move between schools, because as they get turfed out of one home, they move some significant distance away and they can't continue at the school they were at. So that's very disruptive educationally. Anyway, that's a long way from home insurance, but these matters are all ultimately connected, Marvin.
Well, things you've written, you've mentioned that maybe New Zealand requires a paradigm shift in our approach to governance and risk management. And I guess This would be one of the part of the paradigm shifts that we...
Yes, I mean, in talking about climate change, as we have in the past, Marvin, one of the things that people need to understand, but I appreciate it's challenging, is that we are entering a very different period of human history, not just technologically and geopolitically, but ecologically. And we're going to be faced with ever-increasing risk from various kinds of natural hazard events. And we're going to be faced with very significant sea level rise. We don't know yet precisely how much, but it's going to be pretty substantial. It's almost certainly going to be over a meter and probably many meters over the coming centuries and beyond. And as a result, we're going to have to move vast numbers of people out of harm's way all over the world. And that is going to be very disruptive and very costly. So, what is really important for people to understand is that we are facing unprecedented risks that humanity has never had to deal with before. To be sure, there have been occasions where communities have had to be moved because of massive earthquake damage or storm damage or whatever. But we've never had to move potentially hundreds of millions, if not possibly billions of people out of harm's way because of climate change and its effects, particularly sea level rise, but also much more severe droughts, much more severe heat waves, and so on. So that is going to pose huge challenges, and we need to be putting in place policies across multiple areas of government policy that are going to be fit for purpose in this new environment. A different way of putting it, Marvin, would be to say, we're going to be faced with a slow motion catastrophe with climate change, which is going to be punctuated by real dramatic catastrophic events of the kind that, well, we've witnessed now in New Zealand, but many, many other countries have witnessed as well. Much more severe storms doing huge amounts of damage and displacing thousands of people. So, if we don't recognize what's coming at us from the future, we are not going to put in place the kinds of policies that we need, including in the area that I'm talking about today mostly, helping to ensure that we have comprehensive, available and affordable home insurance for people. And where it is clearly going to be too risky for people to keep living, we are going to have to move them out of harm's way. So the answer to people who simply say, oh, well, let the market rip, let prices fall where they will, what that fails to recognize is that many, many, many people are going to be trapped in that model. They'll lose insurance, they'll potentially lose their mortgage, they'll be faced with bankruptcy. For those who don't have a mortgage but a house that's valueless, they'll have no possibility of moving somewhere else. So they'll be stuck in a house that's at increasing risk of flooding or sea level rise, inundation, and so on, coastal erosion and what have you. And what are they going to do? I mean, if they can't move, they won't move. And as a result, there will be ever more damage done, ever more harm suffered, and ever more money spent on disaster recovery and reconstruction. far, far better to invest upfront in a proactive, preemptive, precautionary way and move people out of harm's way into homes that are going to be insurable.
When you're facing disaster, don't you have to think about acting collectively?
Well, I think so.
I've been reading an interesting book. It doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It's 900 pages about the history of India since Gandhi. And the first quarter of the book talks about refugees a lot because, unfortunately, India was partitioned between Pakistan and India, between Hindus and Muslims, basically.
Yes.
And many, many Hindus had to leave Pakistan and go to India. I won't talk about the violence and so on. This is a few years later. What would they do? Well, the impression I got was that they actually handled the refugee problem quite well, but they did it with collective action. First, the central government, but also the local governments. And they didn't have they all had the idea that all of India and local governments and the national government had to do the best they possibly could for housing them, building houses, getting them on land they could use, and making their life in the future bearable so that they could be a more successful society. And at that time, Nehru was prime minister, and it was a strongly social welfare state like Scandinavia. I mean, they didn't have the resources that Scandinavia.
No, I was going to say.
But with the resources they did have, they used them well for the refugees.
Sure. Yes.
It was a collective decision.
Yes. So I suppose philosophically, Marvin, one of the broader questions here is, what is the role of the state? And in my view, if you think about what are some of the defining functions of the state, or what is sometimes called inherently governmental functions, one of them, in my view, is the government has a responsibility to take on risks that no individuals or very few individuals are able to bear themselves. And or they simply cannot insure themselves for one reason or another. And that's one of the reasons we have, across most developed countries, publicly funded health insurance arrangements of various kinds, because lots of people aren't able to cope with the particular health issues they suffer. One of the reasons we have entities like the Natural Hazards Commission in New Zealand and its equivalents in many, many other countries is because it's been recognised that there are certain types of natural hazard events that people simply can't insure themselves against because they're simply too devastating, and insurers won't take on the risk. So I think one of the critical issues here is coming to terms with, well, what are the defining functions of the state or inherently governmental functions, and then ensuring that those functions are carried out effectively and fairly and reasonably and so on. And it's that sort of philosophical disposition that has led me to the view that we should be reforming our home insurance arrangements by extending the responsibilities of our Natural Hazards Commission on the basis that there are going to be ever-increasing risks from climate change, that it will not be possible for individuals or indeed for small firms and so on to cope with without assistance. And this is where you need a government with appropriate powers and capabilities and funding instruments to be able to step in and help.
This is financial resilience, isn't it, in a sense?
Yes, absolutely, Marvin. I mean, this isn't just about social welfare, if you like. It's also about helping to ensure that we have the conditions for economic prosperity and general well-being. So, the argument here basically is that it's going to be economically preferable to have in place policies that help to avoid and reduce and manage risks, and in particular risks, as I've indicated, that it isn't reasonable to expect individuals to bear. And this is not simply my view. I mean, it's a view that's been widely supported now for generations in multiple countries. I'm mindful, without diverting unduly, that when the Australian Federal Treasury developed its well-being framework about 20 years ago, before we developed living standards framework and then the well-being framework. When the Australian Federal Treasury developed their framework, they had 5 kind of criteria that they placed a lot of emphasis on, and one of them was the issue of risk management. And the basic point that was underpinning this well-being framework in Australia, and this is from the Australian Federal Treasury, so this is very much kind of taking an economic view of things. It was to ensure that governments play their role in helping individual citizens and businesses and so on manage risks that are really beyond their capacity to manage independently and individually.
Of course, Australia never went as far ideologically down the neoliberal path as New Zealand.
No. Well, not at the federal level anyway. No.
Yeah. The other thing that concerns me is that we have this attitude toward debt. And for instance, if I wanted to, if I've got a house, I do have a house. In fact, I had this experience for, 20 years. I kept the roof I had. It was an old tile roof that had been 50 years old. But it got more and more, it didn't actually leak a lot, but I was told that it was about to collapse and that it would cause me real problems. Now, if I'd had an accountant, they'd have probably told me, don't borrow money, you shouldn't ever borrow money, go into debt, if they'd had that kind of philosophy. But my next door neighbor, who's a builder, would tell me, if you don't do it, you'll lose your house.
Right.
And so sometimes it's necessary to borrow money, whether you're a private person or a government.
Of course.
And maybe we have too cautious an attitude, because I know that governments, including the United States and in many other governments that aren't necessarily socialistic at all, find they can borrow money cheaper than private corporations can.
Correct. And that's right. But Marvin, I suppose one of the points I'm trying to make here is that one doesn't have to be socialistic or a social democrat to actually embrace some of the proposals that I'm advancing. One only really needs to recognize that we're facing new and unprecedented risks because of climate change, that those risks are going to be beyond the capacity of many individuals and communities to bear, and that one of the ways in which we can ensure a reasonable level of economic and societal resilience in the face of these risks is for governments to put in place policies that help to ensure against these risks, but also policies that try and avoid new risks being taken on by stopping people building in areas that are going to be areas of increasing risk, that help reduce risk by moving people who are at significant risk out of harm's way, moving the homes and moving the infrastructure and so on, and helping to subsidize, to at least to some extent, the cost of insurance where people can't afford insurance of the kind that would be desirable. And just something I probably should have mentioned a long time ago, Marvin, but we need to realize that insurance costs have gone up. This is home insurance enormously over the last quarter century or so. In the period from the year 2000 to 2025, average insurance premiums went up over 900%, ninefold, in a context where where prices more generally went up only just over 200%, twofold. So in other words, the cost of insuring your home for the average person in New Zealand has risen at 4 times the rate of inflation over the last 25 years. In my case, the home that we own in Wellington, if you went back 4 years ago to early 2022, it cost me $2,000 to insure the house and contents. When I got my bill a few months ago to insure the house for 2026, the bill was almost $8,000, a 4-fold increase in barely 4 years. Now, I can afford to do that, thankfully, though at some point it's going to become really unaffordable, even for someone like myself. But lots of people wouldn't be able to pay out $8,000 or close to that to insure their home. And we're dealing with a relatively modest villa in the middle of Wellington here. We're not dealing with a palace. And moreover, in addition, of course, rates have gone up a lot and are going to be going up probably even more. And various other kinds of costs, like energy costs, are going up. So for many, many people, particularly people who don't have a mortgage but have a lowish income, insurance costs are going to be an ever-increasing challenge. I just in this context, just thinking about it globally, sort of what's happening, Marvin, the costs of damage or insurance losses, I should put, the insurance damages have been rising globally at about twice the rate of global economic growth. So global economic growth has been around 3% for the last 40, 50 years. Insurance losses have been going up at around 6%. So, you just do the maths. At some point, if that trend continues, and there's no reason to believe it won't because of climate change and so on, it might even increase. We'll have a point of reckoning in which it simply becomes increasingly unaffordable for substantial numbers of people to insure their properties. And my view is that as those circumstances become more and more evident, we will need to have a complete rethink at the policy level as to how we move forward. Because if we can't insure our properties, that will be disastrous for societies.
In some ways, I don't know how you make this happen, but both the government must come to understand, the people must come to understand that we have a common good, and it's up to society, often through government, to try to protect people's present and future, particularly when you're going to have to ask many people to move.
Yes.
People, if their life and experience of society and government has been negative,
yes,
why getting them to cooperate and trust you.
Yes, I mean, some fairly, sure, Marvin, and I think, just building on what we've been talking about, there's some fairly fundamental issues here, really, about the extent to which we see ourselves as our brother and sister's keeper, so that, that we think about society as a society, not just as a whole set of completely independent, autonomous, isolated individuals, but rather as a cohesive, hopefully cohesive society in which we are mutually interdependent and have both rights and responsibilities towards one another, and that those responsibilities apply not just right here and now, but they apply moving forward, so that we have responsibilities to future generations. We also have, in my view, responsibility to use the evidence and insights that we have available to us through the scientific community and others to be fully aware of the kind of changes that are occurring in the world around us, including ecologically as a result of things like climate change, and to and to be using that foresight effectively to prepare for what is coming and to help minimize some of the costs and damage, as well as share the costs and damage fairly. That's sort of my approach to things, Marvin. I appreciate not everyone takes the view that I do philosophically.
It looks like in some ways we're already facing an economic crisis, not just because of climate change, but because of political and military policies, particularly the United States. I suspect that if this war on Iran continues, even if it was stopped tomorrow, I think we'd face real economic problems. Will face economic. But if this continues, we're going to face something like a Great Depression. And we have to decide how we deal with that as a society and how we hopefully don't play the blame. I've just had a talk with an acquaintance, and he was blaming our problems on immigration. And we mustn't try to not deal with the problems that we're facing by blaming minority groups or immigrants or others.
It's very easy to blame the other people who are.
That doesn't solve your problem. That just creates much greater problems, as you can see in the United States.
Absolutely. And without going into the context of the war in Iran at the moment, I mean, it's pretty clear that one of the damaging impacts of climate change will be the displacement of large numbers of people internationally and locally, so that we will have internal migration in New Zealand as a result of climate change, but we will also have more and more people wanting to come to New Zealand as a refuge from the countries that they are currently citizens of, but which are suffering more severely from climate change than New Zealand is or appears to be. And that will, of course, include people from the Pacific, particularly from the low-lying atoll states, which are at great risk from climate change, and where planned relocation is going to have to be part of the solution, sadly, for them, because they will lose their traditional lifestyle and culture to a significant extent. But in my view, we as a country that has capacity to absorb more migrants, albeit we need to do that carefully, we should be welcoming the people who are being displaced, not putting up barriers completely to their arrival or making them very uncomfortable if indeed they do come to New Zealand. Anyway, but that's a little bit away from insurance issues, Marvin. But
sorry about that.
No. But I mean, one of the issues which we come back to is of course shelter, housing, and one of the reasons for my book focusing on residential property insurance as opposed to all property insurance is because shelter is a basic human right. And we need to try and ensure that we adequately house our own citizens and indeed those who may arrive as climate refugees, and that we ensure that those homes that we provide for people in one way or another can be insured against the inevitable disasters which are going to strike this country and strike with increasing frequency over the coming decades and beyond.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for coming on, and thank you for your continued work and efforts to alert people to the problems we face and some of the ways we can make ourselves more resilient not only as individuals, but as a society.
That's right. Well, thank you, Marvin, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute, and I wish you well.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan Boston on insurance and the community.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.